Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. This is a truly fascinating historical text, written to what we can honestly best describe as a chaotic startup community in the ancient world. I mean, they had a ton of passion, for sure, but operationally, they were an absolute mess. Paul's letter is basically a masterclass in crisis management, theological correction, and community building. So let's jump right in and see exactly how he tries to bring some order to this early movement.
Right out of the gate, we're thrown into the drama. The community is fracturing into these totally tribal factions, all aligning behind different prominent leaders. You've got some saying they follow Paul, the founder. Others prefer Apollos, who was known to be this incredibly eloquent speaker. Others claim Cephas, and some just bypass everyone and claim Christ directly. It's basically an ancient popularity contest, and it is completely tearing the fabric of their unity apart.
So, how does Paul handle this? He hits them with this absolutely piercing question: Is Christ divided? It's a brilliant rhetorical move. He's actively challenging their division and setting the stage for a letter that doesn't just offer abstract, high-level theology, but gets right down into their real human messiness. He asks them, "Was Paul crucified for you?" to immediately remind them that their allegiance is fundamentally misplaced when it's resting on human leaders.
Okay, to put out these fires, the letter follows a really fascinating progression. We're going to look at 1, a community divided, 2, everyday ethics and morality, 3, freedom versus responsibility, 4, spiritual gifts and love, and finally 5, the ultimate hope, resurrection.
Let's start with section 1, a community divided, and look at the factions of Corinth. What was actually driving all this? Well, it turns out intellectual arrogance was the main culprit. The people there were completely obsessed with status, eloquent speech, and what they considered to be profound wisdom. To dismantle this pride, Paul introduces a really powerful paradox. You see, the ancient world demanded very specific types of wisdom. You had Jews demanding miraculous signs, and Greeks looking for deep philosophical wisdom. But Paul just totally flips the script here. He presents what he calls God's foolishness, the concept of a crucified Messiah. Now, to the ancient world, a crucified savior was the ultimate weakness, right? An absolute stumbling block. Yet Paul argues that this apparent foolishness is actually the very power of God. Encountering the resurrection is like entering a cosmos of joy. It's a stunning argument. He's saying God intentionally bypassed human status to build this community. He deliberately chose the lowly, the despised, and the things that are not to completely destroy any possible reason for them to boast or divide themselves up. Because think about it, if God chooses the weak to shame the strong, then arguing over which human leader is the most impressive completely misses the entire point of their own faith. Moving right along to section 2, everyday ethics and morality, we're shifting from philosophical divisions to some highly practical, everyday ethical disasters. And trust me, things were getting incredibly messy on the ground in Corinth. Paul literally has to call out a shocking case of sexual immorality happening right out in the open. A man is sleeping with his father's wife, and Paul notes that this is something even the pagan culture around them wouldn't tolerate. But what really blows Paul's mind isn't just the act itself, it's the community's reaction. He strongly rebukes them for being arrogant and proud of their so-called tolerance, instead of grieving the situation and removing the offender to protect the integrity of the group. And this behavior reveals a much wider problem. I mean, he highlights the absolute absurdity of believers dragging each other into public courts for lawsuits in front of unbelievers. Imagine taking a petty internal HR dispute to a public secular judge. Paul tells them the mere fact they are suing each other means they've already lost. He's showing them that this hyper-individualistic, self-serving behavior is entirely incompatible with what they are supposed to be building. That brings us to section 3. Freedom versus responsibility, specifically the meat market problem. Now, this tackles a very specific ancient cultural issue, but you'll see it actually holds a really profound lesson for us today. Eating food that had been sacrificed to idols. In Corinth, the absolute best meat at the market often came from pagan temple sacrifices. The Corinthians loved to throw their own slogan back at Paul, basically saying, hey, everything is permissible for me. Because they intellectually knew that idols weren't real gods, they felt totally free to just go ahead and eat the temple meat. Well, Paul technically agrees with their theology, the idols are nothing, but he introduces a massive paradigm shift regarding personal freedom. He says, just because you have the right to do something doesn't actually mean it's beneficial. It creates this really fascinating tension between individual rights and community health.
You might have the correct theological knowledge that lets you eat that meat guilt-free. But if exercising that freedom damages the conscience of a fellow community member and maybe emboldens them to act against their own conscience, you've failed. He concludes that if your right wounds the conscience of someone else and causes them to stumble, you are actually sinning against the community. Responsibility trumps personal freedom every single time. All right, Section 4, Spiritual Gifts and Love. Unsurprisingly, their intense obsession with status totally spilled over into how they operated when they all got together in one room for worship. Total chaos in the gathering. So, to fix these highly individualized, chaotic meetings, he brings in the famous metaphor of the body. He explains that a body is a single, unified unit made up of many parts. The eye cannot turn to the hand and say, "I don't need you." The head cannot say to the feet, "I don't need you." Actually, scratch that. It's more profound. The parts that seem weaker are, in reality, the most indispensable. It's a beautifully vivid analogy for a community that desperately needs to start valuing every single member equally. It's kind of wild to think they were treating these incredible spiritual gifts like a high school popularity contest. You had some people with gifts of healing, some speaking in different tongues, some prophesying, and some with deep wisdom. The Corinthians were elevating flashy things, like speaking in tongues, way above the rest. But Paul stresses that while the parts are entirely different, they are all distributed by the exact same Spirit, and they're given for one specific reason: the common good. And this perfectly sets up that famous chapter 13 climax. We hear this chapter at weddings all the time, right? But here's the thing. Paul didn't write it as a romantic poetry. He wrote it as a direct, stinging rebuke to a noisy, arrogant, and highly competitive church. He's telling them that no matter how gifted, how spiritual, or how deeply knowledgeable they are, without love, they are literally just making a massive, annoying racket. When you read it in the context of their lawsuits, their sexual scandals, and their factional division, we see what Paul is really doing here. Love is being presented as the highly functional, incredibly practical solution to their community crisis. Think about it. Love isn't easily angered. Boom, that solves the lawsuits. It doesn't boast and isn't proud. That completely solves the intellectual factions. Love is the essential glue holding this diverse body together. Finally, we reach Section 5, the ultimate hope, resurrection. In chapter 15, Paul completely shifts the tone. He elevates their vision to this grand, cosmic scale, presenting what he calls the absolute foundation of his entire message. Because some people in Corinth were actually doubting the resurrection, Paul anchors his claim in verifiable history. He presents it almost like a legal defense. He lays out this precise timeline of eyewitnesses to prove that Christ was indeed raised. He lists Peter, the 12, an incredible moment where Jesus appeared to more than 500 brothers at the same time, and he notes most of them were still alive to be questioned. Then James, all the apostles, and finally Paul himself. He is establishing a rock-solid historical foundation here. To explain how the dead are raised, he contrasts our origins. He says we all inherit an earthly, perishable body from the first man, Adam, a body made of dust. But Christ, whom he calls the last Adam, introduces a completely new, imperishable, spiritual reality from heaven. The idea is that just as we have borne the likeness of the earthly man, believers are also going to bear the likeness of the man from heaven. Now, what's absolutely striking here is the sheer stakes involved. Paul doesn't mince his words at all. He admits that if the resurrection is just a metaphor or some nice myth, the entire faith collapses. If the dead aren't raised, they are still in their sins, and Christians are literally the most pitiable people on earth. The whole shebang hinges entirely on this single historical event being true. But because he insists the resurrection is real, he ends the chapter with this incredibly triumphant taunt against death itself. He declares that the perishable will be clothed with the imperishable. Death has been completely swallowed up in victory, turning mortal weakness into immortal triumph. It is such a stunning, deeply hopeful conclusion to a letter that started out by addressing such messy, petty human failures. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. We've been looking at a text written to people separated from us by millennia. Yet their struggles with intellectual pride, their struggles balancing personal freedom with community responsibility, and their desire to find unity despite profound diversity, it all feels incredibly relevant, doesn't it? So, how can a 2,000-year-old letter to a messy startup community still challenge our modern ideas of freedom and togetherness? Think about that as you process everything we've covered today. Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating text with me.